This discussion is a sequel to the earlier discussion in which we were talking about the reformist initiatives from within Indian society provoked to a large extent by alien cultural presence, especially Christianity. But in the course of this discussion, we also realized that much of the reformism that the great intellectuals like Ram Mohan Rai and others actually preached, including people who came after him in the Brahma movement in Bengal or his intellectual, ideological descendants elsewhere in India, personalities like Chiplonkar or Ranade in Western India or Birasalingam Pantalu in Southern India. Such people actually thought in terms of a great Indian civilization and the need for restoring the purity of this culture that had over time been contaminated by priestcraft, by the deviation from an old pristine culture. So one can actually see even in these reform movements an element of revivalism. So to distinguish very clearly between reformism and revivalism becomes in any case a very difficult task, because the search for the great Indian heritage or the search for a monotheistic tradition in Indian religion was as much a part of that revivalist imagery as the kind of images that the more aggressive revivalists would do later. This is an important conceptual problem that requires to be borne in mind in order to appreciate the kind of impact that revivalist mentality would make on Indian culture and Indian society in the course of the 19th century. Revivalism was not always blind faith. Revivalism was not always obscurantism. Revivalist ideas can be weighed with reformist attitudes, something which you see among those who thought that monotheism was an accepted practice in the past and it needed to be revived. Provocation of Christianity notwithstanding, this was a part of the cultural engagement that the Indian intellectuals had undergone during that time. So if that is the case, then revivalism was also many dimensions, many different features. We come across intellectual revivalism of different kinds, provoked not merely by the presence of the alien rulers, this was certainly an important factor, but provoked also to a large extent by political questions. The idea that India was an endemically divided land would actually persuade scholars and intellectuals to go back into the past history to dig up the records of Indian unity, political unity in classical or in ancient times. This is one aspect of political revivalism that was manifest in many historical discourses of the time. So some of these intellectuals would go to the extent of suggesting that in India, in the ancient age, democratic institutions had begun to flourish. So the search for democracy would actually persuade them to concentrate on institutions like samitis and sabhas in ancient Indian polity. So this is also an aspect of intellectual revivalism, which was not really an invocation to go back to the past, but it was basically a reassessment of the tradition in order to engage with modernity, to engage with modern ideas, political or social or religious, and the ultimate objective of which was to create a modern India. So we cannot say that despite the revivalist undertone in it, this was necessarily a revivalist mentality in the sense of an obscurantist ideology. You have a modernist ideology couched in a language that would be reminiscent of certain revivalist ideas. So one has to be aware of the different kinds of revivalism. Some were very perfectly blended with reformist ideas. Some were contributing to obscurantist attitudes.
Sir, if we have such kinds of revivalist content even in reformist thought, then how can we distinguish between these two?
That is a natural question which follows from the conceptual issues that I had raised in the early part of this discussion. Usually, revivalism is associated with a certain kind of aggressive mentality. Maybe the reformists and the revivalists, in the sense of a more aggressive intellectuals who would actually find everything that is modern in ancient tradition. And this aggression would actually distinguish between revivalism in this sense and reformism. Because the reformists whom we have already studied were inclined to accept the West, and they had no qualms about it. And the kind of difference that we can easily locate between, say, in political terms, between a man like Tilak, with whom Agarkar, the reformer about whom we had said a few words in the previous discussion, had a running battle about the place of women in Indian society, about how the women should be encouraged to come out of domesticity and participate in public life. So on this issue, they had very serious differences, and each one of them would be able to defend his position in terms of old ideas, ancient practices, in terms of ancient knowledge. So it is possible that the fascination for the ancient knowledge would be one common assumption from which the reformist and the revivalist both would actually work out their ideas. But ultimately, the difference would lie in the greater willingness on the part of the reformists to accept the West and to blend Western knowledge with our own tradition. And those who would not find anything valuable in Western learning, but then they would actually keep on arguing that everything that the West apparently had contributed to Indian culture was available in the Vedas, in the ancient traditions. So the idea was to go back to the Vedas, and from that would emerge a more aggressive statement that whatever that you would actually look for in a modern world, science, technology, rationality, monotheism, in social sphere, in technological sphere, everything was there in the Vedas. So go back to the Vedas. That is where we can see the difference, and that difference arises from the greater amount of aggression that revivalists who were clustering around the Arya Samaj would put into the cultural movements in the course of the 19th century.
Sir, was this aggression and assertion inherent in the Arya movement, or it acquired this over time?
Certainly it acquired this aggression over time, because by the close of the 19th century, when the Arya Samajas became very important in Indian politics, the larger context had changed. But if you go to the 1870s, for example, and think of the ambience in which this Arya Samaj movement had emerged, you see similar kinds of conflicts between those who would actually try to drop out from the mainstream Hindu society in order to create the foundation of a modern reformist initiative. The Brahmo Marriage Bill, for example, in 1872, as you know, created a very significant controversy in Bengal, and it had its ripples in other parts of India as well. So if you look at the 1870s, when the Arya Samaj was formed by the Ananda Saraswati, a Brahmin from Kathiawar, who didn't have much influence in Gujarat and Western India, but who had ultimately came to acquire a considerable amount of following in northern India and the Punjab. You see, the primary objective was to understand the Vedic religion. And if you go through one of his major publications, Satartha Prakash, in which he was looking for the truth that everybody was expected to find in the Vedas. So the entire baggage of rationalism and monotheism, which the Christian preachers was proudly proclaiming as a Western innovation, as a Western contribution to Indian culture, he found in the Vedas, quite rightly. There was a certain urgency on the part of these people to defend Indian culture from the kind of charges that the Christian missionaries were leveling against it. But at the same time, as 19th century drew towards its close, the intonations began to change. it did not remain anymore the kind of intellectual revivalism with which we can easily associate Dayananda Saraswati, as much as we see this kind of intellectual revivalism in people like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, for example. The Arya Samaj, that the Arya movement that Dayananda's preaching had been able to generate, became more preoccupied with the question of proselytization, the Suddhi, to bring people who had gone out of the main Hindu tradition, who had gone out of the Hindu fold, required to be brought within the Hindu fold by performing Shuddhi. So it is at this point the character of the Arya Samaj itself began to undergo very significant changes. Dayananda, in the first place, stated that there was no point in deriving lessons from the Western texts. You have a text here. So it was an attempt to find out the textual basis of a religion. And to the extent that this was looking for a textual basis of the religion, this ran against the syncretic religious tradition that Hinduism itself had evolved over a long period of time, over centuries. And such kinds of textualism was capable of generating what we describe as modern fundamentalism, that for certain fundamentals of a religion, you have to have certain texts. And instead of actually giving much reliance on the practices, you have to go by the texts. So this kind of textual fundamentalism, even if it was enabling the Arya Samajis to claim the same kind of eminence for Hinduism as Christianity, was also actually trying to erode the syncretic tradition on which basis Hinduism as a polytheistic culture, as an idolatrous culture, but at the same time a syncretic culture, had evolved through centuries. So this is a very important point that requires to be borne in mind. But over time, as I was saying, that there was a shift, and a shift towards proselytization, and we represented by the purification idea, the Suddhi idea. The Arya Samaj itself became divided. It was not as if that all those who were followers of Arya Samaj became enamored by this kind of fundamentalist or revivalist attitude. Some of these continued to adhere to the reformist schema by emphasizing the importance of education. So many of these Aryas, the moderate ones, were interested in education. They set up the Dayananda Anglo-Vedic Trust, through which they thought that modern education could be imparted to the larger public. Some of these, the more militant one, did not agree with this kind of a moderate position and suggested that the primary objective of Arya Samaj was proselytization, was Ved Prachar. And Ved Prachar included, as one of its aspects, Shuddhi. And we also know that there would be a time when such ideas would eventually remove the distance that the Arya Samajists had with the Sanatanists.
Sir, what were the basic differences between the Arya Samajists and the Sanatanists?
The basic difference is the Sanatanists would actually continue to adhere to the established religious practices. They would say that Hinduism is great, the polytheistic culture is great, we actually worship the formless Brahma through many images, and this is the best religion for the ordinary folks who are incapable of understanding the quality of a Brahman without quality, Nirguna Brahma. So there would always be a defense of what is called the Shakar form of worship, that you worship images instead of worshipping the Nirakar Brahma, and this is defended on the ground that it is difficult for the ordinary folks to relate to the formless deity, the formless creator. So for them, religion becomes more meaningful when you actually worship the Shakar deity. So that is, I think, the basic difference, that the Sanatanists would argue that there was no point in contemplating about the reform of this religion, because this religion in any case was so great that it didn't require to undergo this process of reform. And this could actually lead to a certain kind of blindness with which we occasionally associate revivalism, blindness on orthodoxy, that you simply shy away from all these reformist initiatives and cling to whatever you practice and whatever you believe without actually putting these beliefs and practices under scrutiny. So you can see the clear difference between how the Sanatanists would project as religion and how the revivalist, who despite their revivalist attitude would still look for reform. And that was, I think, the main difference between Arya Samajist and the Sanatanists in northern India. The Arya Samajists believe in the greatness of Indian civilization, but thought, just in the same way as many of the reformers had done, that Hinduism had deviated from this ideal condition and acquired certain practices which over time had corrupted this religion. And the need of the hour was to purge this religion of these corrupt practices, conforming to the religion that features in the text. By following the same logic, you can distinguish between the form that the Ramakrishna movement took in Bengal under Vivekananda, who had a very short life, but by the time he was dead, he was able to create a kind of monastic order to preach the Vedantic religion. Once again, a certain emphasis on monotheism was integral to it, but not really discarding the culture of idolatry. So unlike many of the Aryas or unlike the Brahmas, Vivekananda and his followers within the Ramakrishna movement were more willing to accommodate some features of the traditional Hinduism, but still thinking in terms of the reform. But the reform was, for as far as Vivekananda was concerned, was not limited to religion alone. Religion was one aspect, but the kind of practices that traditional Hinduism, Sanatan Hinduism had generated over time, practices like untouchability. It was a target of Vivekananda's criticism as much as it was actually decried and criticized by Dayananda. It is possible, therefore, for you to mark out the similarities, but such awareness of similarities should not actually blind us to the fact that many different attitudes also existed. There were varying emphasis towards the West, there were varying emphasis towards tradition, and such varieties needed to be kept in mind before we actually use very loosely the labels like revivalism. Vivekananda was a revivalist. Vivekananda believed in the greatness of ancient culture, but at the same time he realized that over time this greatness had been completely undermined by the level of corruption to which the Hindu religion had descended, and it was important to revive this. It was important to revive the pristine glory of this religion by purging it of many of these unholy, unwelcome practices. Ramakrishna movement started as a different kind of a movement which was created by a mystic around whom the lower middle class people, as Sumit Sarkar Udas was believed, clustered. They found some solace in his preachings, some escape from the kind of drudgery and the social inertia that had affected them. The sense of grievance was partly resolved by Ramakrishna's message, but the mystical movement ultimately acquired the character of a kind of a monastic order under Vivekananda with a particular objective of making India stronger again, culturally, intellectually, socially. So this was an important contribution of a man like Vivekananda, and we have already seen the kind of the similarity that exists between Vivekananda or some of the ideas of Dayananda, but their evocations ultimately would be different. We have to be aware of these differences that existed. But one thing is clear, that whether it is Dayananda Saraswati in the Arya Samaj or Vivekananda starting a kind of a reformist, but at the same time revivalist, cultural, religious movement, the difference between them and the Sanatanists would always be clear. And the Sanatanist impact on Indian social life would become much more clearer, become more manifest in the course of the 1890s. The Sanatanists were not sitting idle. They were also setting up their own organizations like Bharat Dharma Mahamandal in Hardwar. It had its many branches in different parts of the country. It took up certain issues from the Arya idea of cow protection, and then through their itinerant preachers would actually spread the message of cow protectionism in different parts of the country, leading to a massive popular cow protection movement. The Sanatanists would be working together with these militant Aryas as great propagators of the Deva Bhasha. You have this Hindi movement in the 1880s and 90s. The main center was Banaras. One of the early protagonists was Bharatendu Harishchandra, and the Hindi movement was patronized by these Sanatanists and also the Aryas by way of taking a position against the Persian culture, against Urdu. So that would lead to a major language controversy in later half of the 19th century, particularly in the last quarter of the 19th century. Whether it is with regard to defense of existing religious practices or with regard to the idea of protecting cow as a kind of a symbolic assertion of Hindu cultural identity, or in terms of defending Hindi as the Deva Bhasha in official usage. So you have the Sanatanists veering around some of the concrete ideas about how to make their assertion in Indian society at that time, and they were also acquiring their own outfits by that time in Bharat Dharma Mahamandal.
Sir, how do you actually find the influence of orthodox Brahmanical ideology on the ordinary people?
So that was the point that I was actually making by referring to the cow protection movement. This actually would require a more detailed discussion about how the ordinary people continued to be swayed by Brahmanical ideology, especially casteism. You know, whether it was the Brahma movement initially was not so averse to caste, but as Sadharan Brahma Samaj became active, they became extremely critical of casteism. Dayananda and Vivekananda also had the same negative attitude towards casteism, but the Sanatanists would defend it. The Sanatanists would defend casteism by suggesting that it was a part of the fourfold division of society, it was a part of Chaturvarnam, and that it to be adhered to. Now the point is that one of the ways through which the ordinary people would actually try to engage with this kind of an ideology was to aspire for a superior status within the caste hierarchy. Some people explain the participation of the cowherd caste in the cow protection movement as one of the ways through which they were actually trying to uplift their status in the Brahmanical caste hierarchy by emulating the practices of their superior castes. So this is what is often described as Sanskritization. Sanskritization in the sense of adoption of the behavioral patterns, the cultural modes of the superior caste by the lower castes, who actually did not follow a Brahmanical way of life. Now this is of course a two-way process. The priest would actually inculcate in their mind certain allegiance to Brahmanical ritual order, but at the same time these people on their own would be willing to rise up in the caste hierarchy by emulating the social behavior and the cultural or the religious behavior of the superior caste. So that is where you see a certain persistent impact of Brahmanical orthodoxy on popular mind, that despite all these talks about reform, some of the lower caste people who did not strictly belong to the upper echelons of the Brahmanical caste order and had no reason to be so enamored by the kind of orthodoxy that the Sanatanists were preaching, still felt impelled by the desire to rise up in the social hierarchy by emulating their social behavior in order that the superior caste would accept them as somewhat superior in the caste hierarchy, would lift them up from the bottom layers of the caste hierarchy to a slightly superior layer. And that required for these people a conscious adoption of the behavioral traits or the cultural behavioral patterns of the superior caste. This is something which has been described, as I was telling you, Sanskritization, and the Sanskritizing tendencies in India in the course of the 19th century, by which you have this clear indication of lower caste seeking to acquire superior status in this process, is a clear evidence of how orthodoxy could still make an impact at the popular level. But Sanskritization and the kind of impact that it had made on the caste movements in the 19th century, this actually requires a full-length discussion.